is CNN Breaking News.
And out front tonight, Stephen Moore, former senior economic advisor for the Trump campaign. He was also an informal advisor to the White House on tax policy. Also with us, Keith Boykin, former Clinton White House aide, and Tim Naftali, CNN presidential historian and former director of the Nixon Presidential Library. Gentlemen, great to have you on.
It's nice to be here.
Thank you.
So, Tim, I'm going to just start with you, just for perspective here. What does it say to you that the president seems to be breaking with tradition by not holding a year-end press conference at this point?
Well, what's really interesting is that when Mr. Trump ran for president, he pushed the idea that he was a great salesman, and he was very good at selling his candidacy, but he has not been that effective at selling his presidency. Look at his approval ratings. Why he would lose or miss an opportunity to promote his program and to answer questions deftly, I don't know. There are ways to distract from Russia. If he got a question he didn't want to answer, there are ways to handle that. You would think by now he would have learned how. But this president has only had one news conference. It is the lowest number of news conferences for any first-year president in modern presidential history. He doesn't have the practice. It's a shame. He missed a grand opportunity today.
And you don't, does it signal to you that his aides perhaps were concerned he didn't have the discipline to stick to an answer on the Russia investigation, and that's...
Well, I don't know their motives.
Yeah.
I'm saying that this is yet another missed opportunity for this president. He had a lot to say, he could have said, and he has to learn how to answer questions. Not every question was going to be about Russia.
Okay, Stephen, I'm going to go to you because, as Tim said, the president has bragged about being a salesman, yet he says the tax plan is becoming so popular that he won't need to sell it much. Let's take a listen.
Mr. President, can you talk a little bit about how much you'll travel to sell this tax
I don't think I'm going to have to travel too much to sell it. I think it's selling itself. It's becoming very popular. But I think you'll see something on February 1st when they open up the paycheck. That's when you're going to start to see it.
But polls show, Stephen, only 33% favor this plan. Do you think he's making a mistake thinking he doesn't have to sell it?
Well, look, Pamela, I mean, are these the same polls that showed that Hillary Clinton was going to win 40 states in November? I think we've all learned that polling isn't very accurate in terms of, how people really feel about things. But look, this was probably Donald Trump's best week in office. I think, it's interesting. You said, well, he only has 2 victories, the Supreme Court appointment of Gorsuch, and then, of course, this tax cut. That's like saying, well, gee, he only hit 2 grand slams in the bottom of the 9th inning to win the game.
To be clear, he was saying he had more legislative victories than any past president. There were 2 legislative. Of course. He pointed out. So we were sticking with the facts there.
I know. I get it. I'm just saying, yeah, maybe he only had 2 legislative victories, but for conservatives, those are really, really big victories. And I got to tell you, there's a euphoria among conservatives the last couple of days over this tax bill. We were very nervous about whether it would happen. I'm not too concerned about the polls on the tax cut because I think that this victory kind of does speak for itself. And I do think when people see, number one, how it impacts the economy, and I'm predicting 4% growth next year, something that would be about double what we had under Obama, and when people actually see the money in their paychecks, I think there will be let me put it like this. I think Democrats, what are they going to run on? I'm going to get rid of that tax cut that Donald Trump gave you. I'm not sure that's a political winner.
Keith, you were shaking your head.
Where to begin? I mean, this tax bill is so unpopular. It's the least unpopular tax bill, I think, that we've seen in decades. It's less popular than Obamacare was at its lowest point. It's lower in popularity than even the 1993 Bill Clinton tax increase. How do you make a tax cut less popular than a tax increase? You do it by skewing the benefits primarily toward the wealthy, which this tax bill does. Now, the president missed an opportunity surely today because there are other things he could have been talking about that he didn't want to talk about, not just Russia. But the government has refused to do anything about the children's health insurance program with 9 million kids who were left uninsured potentially. They just left town and didn't deal with that issue. They haven't dealt with DACA. President Trump said he was going to build a wall. He was going to repeal and replace Obamacare. He was going to lock up Hillary Clinton. He was going to drain the swamp. All these promises that he said he was going to do, he didn't do any of those things, and we're left with the tax bill that basically just gives him a tax break and people like him.
On the Obamacare, though, he does say he repealed the individual mandate, which is essentially getting rid of it. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But just to hit on your point on the tax bill, sure, it's unpopular in the polls, but as Stephen pointed out, more Americans will see more money in their paychecks. Companies like Comcast, Boeing, Wells Fargo, AT&T have already pledged to give bonuses, wage hikes to their employees. So do you think that that will change, that it will become more popular because more people are going to see money in their paychecks?
Well, what we're probably going to see is a one-time impact on this. I mean, what's happening right now is that there's some political stunts and publicity stunts by various companies that are engaging in helping Donald Trump to sell this plan because they benefit from the corporate tax reductions. But in addition to that, we're also seeing that historically, wage increases don't follow tax cuts like this. We saw this in 1986 with the tax reform from 1986. Wages actually fell during that period, 4-year period after the tax cuts.
Reagan.
So there's no guarantee we're going to see any increase this time.
And quickly, to that point, there wasn't really a political lift after you saw the tax cut in 1986, Stephen.
I'm sorry, there wasn't what?
There wasn't the political
quite-
lift. Republicans lost the midterm in 1986.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, you know, what's interesting, I was there in 86 and I was working for Ronald Reagan at the time. And, you know, that's the last time we reformed the tax system. And it's amazing to me. I mean, you go back to 1986, and I remember the vote on the Senate floor to cut the highest income tax rate to 28% from 50%. That passed 97-3. It was supported by Ted Kennedy, Al Gore, Howard Metzenbaum, virtually all of the Democrats. And it's amazing how the Democratic Party has degenerated to the fact that today or this week, not one single Democrat, none, not one in the House or Senate, voted for a tax bill because they said, oh, it's going to cut the highest tax rate to 37%. I mean, I have to say, the Democratic Party has become an anti-business party. Yes, Keith, you're right. Well, let me just make this point. Keith, you're right. This is a pro-business, pro-American business tax cut. It's going to help American corporations, American small businesses, and that. But a lot of people on CNN have been saying it's a pro. You know, Nancy Pelosi said it. This just helps corporations. Well, we want to help corporations. We want jobs coming back to the United States and put America first. And boy, you know, the Europeans and the Asians are not happy at all about this tax cut.
But go ahead,
Well,
Tim
no, I just want, you know, this is not about the Democratic Party. This is about America. I wasn't there in 1986, but I was live, certainly. Yep. You remember, Mr. Moore, or Professor Moore, that because the 1986 tax reform had so many problems with it, George Herbert Walker Bush, who succeeded Ronald Reagan, had to fix it. And it was called the 1990 Budget Act, and I
remember that.
You remember that?
Yep.
Because the 1986
it was the worst
no,
bill in
it
the
was
history of a Republican
it was great. It may have been
a disaster.
Mr.
It's why
sir,
the Republicans lost the presidency
this is not
in
about
1992.
it's not about party. It's about country. The Bush-Clinton recovery of the 1990s is a product of both the first President Bush's approach to tax reform and President Clinton's.
No, it wasn't. George Bush caused a recession. There was a recession in 1990 and 91 after Bush raised taxes.
No, you have your facts.
How can you say that was a success?
The reason why Bush raised taxes
George
is
Bush announced he was going to raise taxes,
debating this in 2017. But the reason why Bush raised taxes is because it created a deficit.
I'm going to let you come back. Let's listen to
George Bush raised taxes and the economy went into recession.
Let me just say one thing here, Stephen. Okay, this tax bill that just passed that President Trump signed is going to blow a hole in the deficit for $1.5 trillion. This is something that even with dynamic scoring analysts, it's still talking about over $1 trillion out of the budget. So if you're talking about being fiscally restrained and fiscal conservatism, you can't support this tax bill. That's the reason why Democrats are so upset about the hypocrisy of Republicans saying that they cared about the deficit, and suddenly when it comes to giving taxes to the wealthy, tax cuts to the wealthy, they don't care about that. In 1990, when Bush raised taxes, it was because they had to do something to clear up the deficit that had been created from the tax cuts of the Reagan era. So let's not try to revise history.
Okay, really, I got to give Stephen the final word here. Go ahead, Stephen.
Okay. Actually, after we raised taxes in 1990, the deficit actually went up. It didn't go down. We called it the worst deal of the century. And by the way, that's changed the Republican Party forever. It's now a party that realized that when you raise taxes, you don't help the economy. But look, I think ultimately this will be resolved by how the economy does next year. If the economy really continues to boom as it's been doing under Trump, I think he will be vindicated, big league, as Donald Trump would say.
All right. Thank you all. I really appreciate that lively discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Tonight, a new CNN poll shows a deep divide along party lines when it comes to sexual assault and harassment. 85% of Democrats say it's a serious problem in the U.S., compared with just 45% of Republicans. And when it comes to whether an elected official should resign over sexual harassment allegations, 78% of Democrats and just 37% of Republicans say yes. And as for the president, 85% of Democrats say the way President Trump treats women is an indicator of his ability to serve as president. Only 38% of Republicans agree with that. Out front now, former communications director for Senator Ted Cruz, Amanda Carpenter, and co-chair of the Women for Trump PAC, Amy Kramer. Ladies, thank you for coming on. There's a lot to discuss here with the polls and everything going on. And Amy, I'm going to start with you. Are you concerned that GOP voters are on the wrong side of history with this issue?
You know, I think that GOP voters are upset about the using this as a political advantage. It is definitely a serious issue, and I'm glad that it's come to the forefront and we are having this conversation. Obviously, there's a big problem in Washington, but I think that people are upset that they're seeing that this issue is being used to drive a wedge for a political purposes, and that's why there's a divide there. And I believe that the Democrats absolutely are using this as a wedge issue, and I think they need to be careful about that.
I have to mention this, though. You did support Roy Moore,
Yes.
and we know what the allegations against him were. He lost after the allegations came to light, even though before that he was projected to win, and women played a big role in handing him the victory. So it does appear that this is playing into voters' minds.
Yeah, Pamela, I agree with you. And listen, I mean, we originally endorsed Mo Brooks in the primary in that race, and we got behind Roy Moore because it was a choice of who is going to support and push for the president's agenda of securing the border and tax reform and repeal and replace of Obamacare. And Roy Moore was the candidate that was going to do that. I respect the voters of Alabama. They absolutely had the information in front of them when they went to the polls. They made their decision. He has not conceded, and I think he should concede. But there's a difference there than, say, with President Trump, that, you know, the voters had the information in front of them, and they went to the polls and they chose President Trump to be the president of the United States. And so we've litigated that. Alabama litigated the Roy Moore race, and it fell where they wanted it to fall, and I respect that decision.
Right, and to be clear, you did campaign with Roy Moore, although you do say sexual harassment is a serious issue. Amanda, what do you think is behind the divide here?
Well, listen, allegations of sexual harassment have always been a political weapon. It's always used to drive a wedge against opponents. And if you want evidence of that, look to the 2016 race where Donald Trump paraded Bill Clinton's accusers before a presidential debate. So that happened. But here's the thing. It's going to go back in Donald Trump's face soon enough, because Donald Trump has his own accusers. So we're going to have another whole round of this. And what remains to be seen, is this going to be a top voting issue? In 2016, it wasn't. Maybe it was because Donald Trump drove Hillary Clinton's negatives up so high, but it didn't stop him. And so the Democrats, how are they going to play this? Are they going to go all in on trying to beat this around Trump again? And maybe they'll have some traction, right? Because people are much more comfortable talking about these issues. I think people would be much more willing to look over Donald Trump's past with more of an enlightened eye. There are people that didn't even want to touch the comments that he made about his daughter because they thought they were too tawdry. I think the environment has changed. Well, but it has to go into Donald Trump's character. And, you know, if they're betting on just taking him down on sexual harassment allegations or his unwillingness to talk about that, it wasn't enough before.
And Amy, you know, you do point out that, yes, Donald Trump was elected despite the allegations of sexual harassment allegations from several women. However, the cultural landscape has changed. There has been a movement, and poll numbers among Republican women are going down for Donald Trump. Are you concerned that this could hurt Republicans in the polls come midterms? I mean, sorry, well, her voters, you know, voters will vote against Republicans come the midterms.
I mean, of course I'm concerned. Absolutely. And I think the party should be concerned. But this is a thing, is that when you have John Solomon coming out last Friday, Thursday or Friday, with this report about some of these accusers being paid money, their mortgages being paid off, I mean, there's a big problem there. And the American people have the ability to understand that. While it is sensational for us to talk about it, and it's definitely an issue that we're facing right now in this country, and I think it's good that the conversation is front and center, at the end of the day, when people go into that voting booth, what they vote on are things that affect them personally. And we just saw historic tax reform passed. And if President Trump goes out there and continues to do what he has said he's going to do, because he is the one person who has campaigned on tax reform and all these things, and he does what he says he's going to do, if he continues to do that and talk about the American workers and the American people and what he's going to do for them, I think that in February, when they start seeing more money in their paychecks and the economy is jump-started, I think that that is what is going to drive people in the polls when they make their decision at the ballot box. I think that ultimately that is what matters.
All right, Amanda, I want to listen to this sound from President Trump in talking about the women who have stepped forward against him. Let's listen to that.
Every woman lied when they came forward to hurt my campaign. Total fabrication. The events never happened, never. All of these liars will be sued after the election.
The stories are total fiction. They're 100% made up. They never happened.
How do you think comments like that, Amanda, play with, Republican women?
Terribly. I mean, here's the thing. If the future elections for Republicans are about a great economy and tax cuts, great. But if they're about clips of Donald Trump saying that and having to answer for that, then that is doom. I mean, the RNC chairwoman, who is a woman, Ronna, formerly Romney McDaniel, apparently she had to drop that because the president didn't like seeing Romney on the letterhead. She went to the White House with a memo saying it's going to be a bloodbath with women, and they pretty much crumpled it up, threw it out the door, and didn't listen to her. If I were her, I would walk
Well, and
out.
she said that. She said, if you back Roy Moore, you're going to do poorly with women, and he ended up backing Roy Moore regardless.
Yeah,
and
so he didn't listen to her at all, which is just a huge sign of disrespect. And then she followed by, having to go back into the race, she made herself look like a fool. So I would have resigned over that if I were her. But like I was saying, if the race is about Donald Trump calling women liars, threatening to sue them, and saying they weren't attracted enough to molest, doom. If they can make it about something else positive, maybe we have a chance.
Okay, thank you so much, ladies. Great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is CNN Breaking News.
And you are in the CNN newsroom on this Saturday. I'm Pamela Brown in for Ana Cabrera. And we begin with stunning insight into how the president privately views immigration. The new reporting comes from the New York Times, which talked to people who either attended or who were briefed on an Oval Office meeting back in June. Now, during this meeting, President Trump reportedly became enraged and began making inflammatory comments as he began reading aloud from a document that detailed how many immigrants had received visas in 2017. The paper writes, quote, Haiti had sent 15,000 people. They all have AIDS, he allegedly grumbled, according to one person who attended the meeting and another person who was briefed about it by a different person who was there. 40,000 had come from Nigeria, Mr. Trump added. Once they had seen the United States, they would never go back to their huts in Africa, recalled the two officials who asked for anonymity to discuss a sensitive conversation in the Oval Office. Now, the White House forcefully denies this report, telling CNN, quote, General Kelly, General McMaster, Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Nielsen, and all other senior staff actually in the meeting deny these outrageous claims. And it's both sad and telling the New York Times would print the lies of their anonymous sources anyway. Joining us now is one of the New York Times reporters who broke this story, Michael Shear. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Sure, happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
So the first obvious question in the face of the strong White House denial is, do you stand by your reporting?
We do. My colleague Julie Davis and I set out 3 months ago to write a story that sort of chronicled President Trump's efforts on immigration, how that effort had evolved from the time he was a candidate and through the first year in the presidency. And part of that, as part of that reporting, we began to hear about this meeting from multiple people, and we heard different stories, and as a reporter, you put it together the best you can from both people that were in the meeting, people that were had talked to folks that were in the meeting, and at the end of the day, we came to believe that the report, as we produced it and published it today, was accurate, was true, and the White House did push back very forcefully. We included their denial in the report that we published on the website today, but we stand by our story.
Two sources told you Trump made these remarks, but other officials say he never used the words huts or aids. Why do you find these two sources that you use for the story more credible than those who are denying it on the record?
Well, look, I mean, that's, as you well know, Pam, I mean, that's something that you do every day as a reporter, is you weigh the motivations of your sources, you weigh, the kind of detail that they told you, how they described events, and whether they, are consistent over time and the like. And we came to believe that the people that were telling us this, described this meeting accurately. We didn't just listen to them. We tried to talk to a whole lot of people, and you're right, we did talk to some people who said they didn't recall those comments being made back in June. And then, as you say, the White House, gave us a statement saying that several of the top officials that were in the meeting denied it. But at the end of the day, after deliberation and looking at our reporting, we stand by the story.
And, as a fellow reporter, I know I've been in those positions before, and this is also a White House who has denied things on the record that do turn out to be true. And you just, have to be able to put that trust in your sources. Were you surprised by these accounts when you were told what Donald Trump had said in the Oval Office? I mean, we are talking about a man who launched his campaign by calling Mexican immigrants rapists and murderers.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think what that the meeting shows from my perspective, and why I think we chose to lead this story with it, is that it shows his frustration at a point in time in his administration. It comes about the midpoint of his first year, and it's at a time when he's increasingly frustrated that the promises that he's trying to put into place, that he talked about during the campaign. You remember, he talked about the wall. He talked about, banning Muslims during the campaign. I mean, this was a person who came into the White House, came into the Oval Office, trying to make good on that promise that was really at the core of his campaign. And by June, he was struggling. The courts were blocking his efforts. We say in the story, we describe a different scene in which he's very frustrated when he has to put in place a second travel ban that he considers watered down and a weaker and more politically correct version of it. So, he's frustrated. The bureaucracy is impeding him. The deep state, you hear that all the time from this White House, that the bureaucrats are kind of pushing back against his agenda. And so I think that's the context of this meeting, and why I think the Oval Office meeting in June sort of shows the kind of the depths of where his frustration was coming from.
And you say in the article you're reporting is that a lot of his attitude toward immigrants long predates his entry into the White House. I got to say, some of this description is that of a xenophobe. You quote a biographer, Michael D'Antonio, as saying he's always been fearful where other cultures are concerned and always had anxiety about food and safety when he travels.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think to take the flip side of it, right, what the White House would say is that the president is motivated by a real passionate concern for safety and for safety of the American public, and that drives him toward a set of policies that shuts kind of the borders down in a way that they haven't been in our country in a long time. And you see that, of course, across the set of policies that the president has been trying to put in place, not just the travel ban, but limits on refugees coming into the country, roundups and a tougher enforcement in the interior of the country and at the border. And so, you know, the question is, where does that come from? Some of that's his advisors that he has around him, but it's also clearly, I mean, from the people we talked to about three dozen people for this story, and it clearly comes also from something just inside him. You know, the kind of reactions that he has to immigrants are very personal and very visceral, according to the people that we talked to.
And you also report that the president has privately shown a soft spot for dreamers. Of course, those are children who were brought to the U.S. They were brought to the U.S. at a young age. What can you tell us about that?
You know, it sort of continues the conversation I was just talking about. Like, what motivates Donald Trump, I think, in part, are these personal experiences, right? He's not a book learning kind of guy, and I mean that in not as a snarky way. I mean, he experiences things, and that's what motivates him. And in 2013. Donald Trump had a very little covered, there were a couple of reports about it, but a very little covered meeting with dreamers. Of course, 2013, long before he was running for president. And, you know, a bunch of the young dreamers came to Trump Tower. They went up, they had a long meeting with him, and they talked about sort of their stories and what they were facing and what their families were facing. And when we talked to the folks who had met with him, they said, you know, he seemed actually sympathetic, and he said, as they rode down in the elevator with him, you know, I believe you. You convinced me. And so, you know, he brings that experience as much as he does the other kinds of experiences that are more, aimed at keeping people out of the country.
You know, it was almost a year ago where the travel ban was first introduced, and I covered that at the time. It was such a chaotic time, and you sort of trace how the approach from the White House has changed. You know, at that time, they left so many people out of the process. The White House was really bucking bureaucracy. How have you seen the president's approach to immigration evolve since that first chaotic introduction of the travel ban?
Yeah, it's really different, both in terms of sort of the outward process and also the process inside. So from the outside, reporters, it was like nothing. And you remember, Pam, nothing we've ever seen. There were no briefings for reporters ahead of time. Nobody kind of knew what was going on. It was, when we asked questions, it turns out, you know, that aides were going back and Googling the answers because they didn't know. Nobody had told them. And then you fast forward, 8 or 9 or 10 months, and you look at some of the policies that the president has successfully put in place over the last few months, limits on refugees, the ending of what's known as TPS, which is a special designation for Haitians who had been allowed to come into the country because of the earthquake there. I mean, these are the way they rolled out those policies, as well as a third version of the travel ban, was much more disciplined, right? They had their ducks in a row. They had sort of instead of the bureaucracy being against them or fighting them, they had figured out how to use the bureaucracy to put those in place, and all of them did get put in place. And so I think what you see is a year that started very chaotically, but over the course of the year, they've really learned to be more effective at putting this kind of thing in place. They're not finished, and they didn't succeed in all areas, and there's a long way to go. But I think if you're a fan of Donald Trump's policies on immigrations, you've got to be somewhat happy that he's making progress.
And you're right. I mean, they didn't succeed in the biggest campaign promise, which was, of course, to build the wall. But certainly it appears some lessons were learned. Michael Shear, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do it. Thank you.
This is CNN Breaking News.